Welcome to new episode of Inside the Economist's Mind. Okay, let's dive into the source material for this deep dive. We've got an excerpt here from a piece by Paul Krugman titled Deindustrialization, Causes and Consequences.
Yes. This is such a central topic, isn't it? In economics and politics, really. This whole idea of manufacturing jobs declining in the U.S. deindustrialization.
Exactly, and our mission, really, for this deep dive is to unpack Krugman's angle on it. Because he argues pretty forcefully that the causes and maybe even the consequences are, well, widely misunderstood.
Yeah, especially the role globalization plays or the impact on workers' wages.
Yeah.
He's kind of pushing back against a story that sounds simple, compelling.
But maybe isn't quite right.
That's his argument. And understanding this, it's pretty crucial for you listening, not just for, judging policy debates.
Right, but for thinking clearly about where work is heading, about economic well-being, maybe getting past some misplaced nostalgia, as he puts it.
It kicks it off with a great little story, too, really grabs your attention.
Oh, yeah, the anecdote about Bill Clinton back in '92 when he was running for president.
That's the one. Clinton apparently asked him, what policies could bring manufacturing back to its old share of employment.
And Krugman's answer?
Basically, he told him it wasn't going to happen. Just not feasible. His analysis, even back then, showed that, look, even if you somehow got rid of the entire trade deficit,
Which is a massive if.
a huge if, even then, manufacturing employment, it would only go up like a little bit. It'd still be way, way smaller as a share of the economy than it used to be.
Wow. Talk about delivering unwelcome news.
Right. And he adds, kind of wryly, that he didn't get a job in the Clinton administration.
Yeah, he mentions that. Says it was probably good for him in the long run.
But it immediately signals, doesn't it? This is someone who's going to challenge conventional wisdom, even the popular stuff.
Absolutely. It's like he's saying, look, the numbers are telling me something different, and I'm going to follow the numbers.
So, okay, what's the main takeaway he wants us to get from this introduction, this excerpt?
Well, he lays out a few key points he plans to dig into. First, this idea, this deindustrialization, it's not mostly about globalization or trade deficits.
Okay, that's a big one right there. And the second...
That's also not the main reason wages have been kind of stagnant or depressed for a lot of workers.
Right, which leads naturally to the third point, I guess.
Which is that trying to, rewind the clock, trying to recreate the manufacturing economy of the 1950s or 60s, that's just not going to help workers today.
So quite a counter-narrative he's setting up.
Definitely. And just to be clear for everyone listening, for this deep dive, we're focusing only on these points as presented in this specific excerpt. We're sticking to the source material provided.
Okay, so how does he start building this case? He brings in some history, right?
Yeah, he uses this really powerful comparison. He compares the shift away from manufacturing jobs now to the much bigger, earlier shift away from farming, agriculture.
The agriculture analogy. That's interesting.
It really is. He says, look, go back 150 years, America was mostly farmers. Today, it's, a tiny fraction of the workforce.
And he mentions he's using census data, Bureau of Labor Statistics data, BLS, to show these huge historical shifts in where people work.
And his point is, well, politicians might talk about rural America, but nobody's seriously suggesting we need to go back to having most people working on farms.
So he's suggesting deindustrialization is maybe a similar kind of long-term economic evolution, perhaps unavoidable.
That seems to be the implication. Using that historical lens helps him challenge the story that lots of people tell today.
Okay, so what is that common narrative he's really pushing back against?
It's that story you hear all the time, right? That back in the 50s and 60s, we had lots of manufacturing jobs, and that's what caused low inequality and a strong middle class.
Uh-huh. And then the flip side is that the decline since then is mostly because jobs went overseas, outsourcing trade deficits.
It's simple, it feels right emotionally, maybe.
But Krugman says, hold on, he says, quote, the math behind the story doesn't work. He's questioning whether that high manufacturing share caused the prosperity in the first place.
Or if the trade deficits are really the main culprit for the decline now, he's skeptical on both counts based on the economics.
And based on that skepticism, he sort of previews his conclusion, what he thinks the data shows.
He says even if, hypothetically, the U.S. managed to wipe out its trade deficit completely.
Which, he notes elsewhere, things like tariffs aren't going to achieve anyway, but sticking to this excerpt.
Sticking to this, yeah. Even if that happened, the boost to manufacturing jobs would be pretty small, modest, he says. Still just a fraction of what it once was.
And maybe the bigger challenge to the common story
Is that any wage gains from that small boost? For ordinary workers, he says they'd be trivial. Tiny.
So that directly hits the idea that just bringing back manufacturing is the solution for wages.
Exactly. It's a much more complicated picture, in his view.
Now, he knows this isn't always a popular message. He acknowledges that, right?
He does. He anticipates that pushback, that some people hear this challenge to the globalization narrative and think, oh, so you just don't care about workers.
Yeah, like challenging this story means dismissing the problem.
But he's very clear. He explicitly states, look, I do care about American workers. Deeply, he implies. His point is that, based on the economics, trying to recreate a 1950s economy isn't the way to help them now.
It's about finding policies that actually work for today's economy, not yesterday's.
Right. He calls relying on that old model misplaced nostalgia. And he warns that policies built on that nostalgia could actually end up hurting workers, not helping them.
He mentions this full article gets a bit wonky, gets into the weeds.
Yeah, but he stresses the stakes are high. Getting the diagnosis wrong leads to the wrong prescriptions.
And just to reiterate, this deep dive is really centered on these foundational points from his introduction. The setup, the critique of the common story.
He does give a little roadmap of the full piece, mentioning he'll talk more about trade's limited role, why deindustrialization isn't the main wage suppressor, and crucially,
What would actually help? What kind of policies could restore a middle-class society?
yes, but again, for our purposes here, we're focused just on this initial framing from the excerpt.
Got it. So this part is really about laying the groundwork, challenging assumptions, setting the stage for a different kind of analysis, using that historical context.
So if we boil it down, just from this specific Paul Krugman excerpt, the big takeaway is, well, he sees deindustrialization as this complex long-term shift. Maybe like the move away from farming, not just some sudden crisis caused by trade.
Uh-huh. And the popular story. The one blaming trade deficits almost entirely and seeing that as the main cause of wage problems. He argues it's largely wrong, rooted in that misplaced nostalgia.
And trying to turn back the clock to that old manufacturing dominance, he suggests it's not feasible, and even if it were slightly more feasible, it wouldn't be the answer for today's workers' economic challenges.
It definitely complicates the simple narrative you often hear, asks you to look a bit deeper.
Okay, so this leaves you, the listener, with something to think about. If Krugman's right, based on this excerpt, that trade isn't the main cause of deindustrialization, and deindustrialization isn't the main cause of wage stagnation, well then what is?
Right. What are the biggest forces shaping jobs and paychecks in today's economy? And if you really want policies to help workers, maybe those policies need to target those forces rather than trying to resurrect an economic structure from, 70 years ago.
It really pushes you to consider the complexity beyond those easy narratives and think about where the real leverage points might be for improving workers' well-being today.
Definitely food for thought there. Thinking beyond the nostalgia.